Tulsa native Russell Cobb is a writer and academic who is currently a professor in cultural studies at the University of Alberta. He's had work featured in everything from Oklahoma's This Land Press to the New York Times. He recently had an article appear in the Tulsa World regarding the new Gathering Place Park and its relation to historic Mvskoke figure Tuckabache. Yeah. Well, it's great to have you on the program. I know recently, the reason we wanted to have you on the program is you appeared in the Tulsa World talking about the Gathering Place and the fact that it's this nice big park, yes, but there are some Mvskoke roots, some deep Mvskoke roots in the land on which it sits. Kind of talk to us a little bit about how you came to writing this article. I know you've got some other projects too, but how did you come to write this article and really what led you to it being published?
Right. Okay. Well, thanks a lot for having me. I just, this is such a passionate issue for me because I grew up literally a block from the Gathering Place, and what we call it Maple Ridge now. It was originally not Maple Ridge at all, and it was a real experience to learn the origins of that land and who it belonged to and the longer history, because I knew nothing about it growing up. No one ever spoke of it at all. And I met a J.D. Colbert, and he told me when I was working on a piece about the Gathering Place, he said, you want to look into a guy named Tuckabache. And so I started to research Tuckabache and his roots into the land, and that led me on a longer quest to find out more about allotment and the dissolution of the tribal nations around the time of statehood. And that just, it's so shocking to me to know that I never learned that in school, and to really learn it, that I was shocked and then also concerned when I learned more about the Gathering Place and learned that, we've got this thing sponsored by Williams and this thing sponsored by Quick Trip and all these oil companies, but nothing, as far as I could tell, honoring the Mvskoke Nation or Tuckabache in particular.
Right, and I think, you're in education, higher education, but education, no doubt. You came up in Tulsa, as you said, educated there, and you talk to other people in the world of academia, I'm sure. As an educator, how disheartening is that to think about now that generations of Tulsans are growing up not really knowing about the true or the original history of their city?
Yeah, it's really disappointing. I mean, I think we're taking the first baby steps forward, and that's promising. For example, I went to, like a lot of people in Maple Ridge, I went to Robert E. Lee Elementary School. That's now been renamed in honor of the Council Oak tree. And those are little steps that we take and we start to rediscover. And I really find that people of my generation, and especially younger, have a hunger for learning this history, because, like somebody said, a writer once said, when you start to learn about Oklahoma history and about some of the crimes that took place that were foundational to our state, which I still love. I'm from Oklahoma. I don't live there anymore, but I still love Oklahoma. But when you start to learn about those foundational crimes, it changes almost the way you relate to yourself and your own identity. It feels like this place is not what I thought it was. And so I think that it's really important for the Gathering Place. It may not be the best PR in the world, but it's very important for them to acknowledge that history and that land, so that we start to move, we incrementally move this process forward.
Yeah, and I know that the tribes were invited out, were a part of the Gathering Place's opening. I know I think some of the representatives from public relations went out there and everything like that. So I can't speak to maybe if there's something in play or if something's going to happen there. I'll certainly have to ask them about that. But I think you make a great point that it is kind of the tide is turning a little bit in favor of more recognition and more education on Oklahoma's real history. Now, you said a writer was talking about Oklahoma history. You, sir, are yourself a writer that's going to be talking about some Oklahoma history. I know you're excited about a book that you're working on. It's going to be a little while before it's out yet, and we'll talk to you then again when it is, so we can talk about that a little bit more. But I know that you're diving into some Oklahoma history right now, and it's got to be pretty fascinating for you. I'm sure that we all know a lot, us that research, but you probably uncovered some things even that you weren't aware of.
Absolutely. I mean, some of the things are we know, and I'm sure anyone who's done a little bit of a, who's bothered to take a little bit of a cursory look into Oklahoma history realizes that it comes out of some pretty dark places in terms of the swindles that happened of native land. But look, it comes out of a pretty conflictive world. But what's really shocked me, what's really blown me away is once I learned about Tuckabache's land, I started to look at other lands. And so I have been meeting with some descendants of people whose allotments were taken. And I mean, not in the distant past of the old Wild West. I'm talking about in courts with lawyers by people whose names are still on the faces of public buildings, of schools, airports, that were instrumental in, what our wonderful state historian Angie Debo called a vast criminal conspiracy. And she was a woman who did not mince words, and I don't think she would have said that if it were anything less than that. And it really was a vast criminal conspiracy that was conducted right in by the leading men of Oklahoma. And so once I started to see that it wasn't just this one isolated case of Tuckabache, but for example, there was a big case of the Naharkey allotments, the Naharkey family, who had a big part of West Tulsa, 3 different generations of them whose lands were taken because they were actually kidnapped. And for example, one of the girls, she was 17 in 1922, and she was abducted by one of the men of a leading oil man in Tulsa, and abducted and harassed and assaulted until she agreed to sign over the deed to her land. And I couldn't believe this, and I couldn't believe that there was nothing written about it. I mean, there was a lot written about it in the 1920s, but not in my work has been real archival work. I mean, in the most basic sense. Not, you can't Google it. You can't Google it. You have to go to the National Archives. You have to request, and you have to see the records of probate cases to see the paper trail of what happened. And when you start to see it, like, for example, you see the way the white guardians came in and would just have people sign an X and deed over their lands for sometimes pennies. Then those guardians would turn around and flip those very same lands for hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, that is just shocking, right? And the thing is that's not just the distant past. And that's one of the things I really want to emphasize, and I want to emphasize in the book, is we might think, well, okay, well, that was 80 years ago, 90 years ago, even 100 years ago, but now we're living in a different reality. Well, we're still just like we were in the 20s, the teens and 20s. We still have an economy that has a lot to do with oil, right? The wealth of the oil industry. Mm-hmm. And that didn't come out of nowhere. That came out of that original crime. Now, I'm not so presumptuous to say what I think, that I have all the answers about what should be done about that. But the first step forward is certainly at least acknowledging it and discussing it and teaching it in schools. And then we can start to have a real honest conversation about where to go from there.
That's an excellent point you bring up there, Russell. And also, I was going to ask you, whenever you were putting together some of your thoughts and some of your material to put that piece out in the Tulsa world, was there any conversations at all that you had, I wonder, with officials of the gathering place, people putting it up, that might lead to you thinking there may be a chance that they are going to give a nod to that history?
Right. I did. Yeah. I mean, I spoke with Jeff Staba, who's the executive director of the park, and he said there are ongoing conversations. He didn't go into details. He said, as you mentioned, Jason, that there was a blessing by some tribal elders that was a private ceremony, and that they have an ongoing conversation about doing something that he said was I'm trying to make sure I get his words exactly right. Meaningful. He said he didn't want to just have a plaque or something, but something meaningful. And so I thought that was promising. You know,
Yeah.
I think that's the right thing to do. But I mean, we've had this. But here's the thing: like, we've had this park in the works for what, 2014, 2015, maybe.
It's been a project, yeah.
It's getting ready to open in a few days. Like, why is that not ready to go? I mean, they've been able to secure multi-million-dollar donations, have play structures, state-of-the-art play structures created in Germany and shipped over. Why are we just now starting to get down and talk about what do we do about the fact that this land was for generations pertained to Tuckabache, not just Tuckabache, but he raised his son. He raised grandchildren there. It was a farm. It was, all kinds of people came through. When the railway came through, he was an old man already, and he really resented that. He tried to fight it in court because it was on his land. He said, I don't want the railroad coming through my land. And they basically swindled him in court and said, no, you leased it to this guy. He said, he didn't know what, he didn't speak English, so he didn't know what he was leasing, and that happened a lot, right?
Right, yeah.
And so he would try to fight that in court, and he lost, and it went straight through where he used to hunt and fish and that sort of thing. So, I've said, and I know some other indigenous people have said, maybe a start is to talk about that trail that now follows that old MKT railroad line. It's now called the Midland Valley Trail, and it's a wonderful resource. A lot of people walk their dogs and ride their bikes. Maybe we should call that Tuckabache Trail.
Yeah.
Maybe we could start there.
Yeah, and I think, talking about it too, that reminds me, you had shared a piece of history, actually. I think it was from the early 20s, maybe, an article that described Tuckabache as a surly old man, I think is what it said. I thought that was great. Sullen, and because he was just not having it.
Sullen old Indian.
Old Indian, yeah.
Sullen old Indian holds fort.
He wasn't having it. He was upset, and he wanted people to know, even if he couldn't, tell them that. I'm sure he told it to them in his Mvskoke language, but they probably didn't understand what he was saying. So
yeah, and he was widely known. He wasn't just some guy out there in the boonies.
Sure.
Like, he was connected to all these things. That was an amazing thing for me, as a non-native person, was to learn. I kind of learned a lot of that part of removal and then the Civil War and territory days and statehood through Tuckabache. Like, it's amazing because he lived through all of it. He was born in the Southeast, experienced removal, fought for the Union, by the way. When much of the tribe sided with the Confederacy, Tuckabache was one of the leaders with Opis Yohola and siding with the loyal Creeks that went there, and so that's somebody who definitely we should be thinking about honoring, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And
yeah, the Tuckabache, you talk to any Creek that knows the history, very prominent figure, definitely, not only in our history, but the city of Tulsa as well, and somebody that I think, everyone in Tulsa should know the story of Tuckabache, certainly.
Absolutely. I mean, it's crazy that we have this divide too. I mean, we've got lots of divides in Tulsa, but one is that this is a story that's well known among Creek people, and I'd be willing to bet that there are maybe one, maybe two other people in the whole neighborhood of Maple Ridge that have heard that name. I've tried. I've reached out a million times. I said, have you ever heard of this? I've talked to people who've lived there for 40 years. They said, no, we just know, and this is a funny story. They said, no, we just know that in our deed to the property, there's a cloud because of the quote unquote dead Indian.
Right.
They just know that there was a dead Indian that's clouding their title to the land. And I said, well, he's not just some dead Indian. He has a name, and he has a history, and he has a very prominent history. So, yeah.
Well, we certainly thank you, Russell, for coming on and sharing some of that history with us today, and really sharing it with Tulsa and putting such an article in the Tulsa World that I thought was highly educational, but more so, it felt like the time is right for somebody to step forward and put together an article like this. So we certainly thank you for that, just as native citizens, but also as a journalist. It was neat to see and neat to jump into some of your other writings too. And we're really going to be excited to see your book come out whenever it's ready. So we'll let you get back to work on that. How about that?
Yeah, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it, Jason. This has been fantastic, and thanks for the opportunity to come talk to you.
All right. Thanks so much, Russell.